Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial's One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities to find out their stories, to find out what it is that's helped them to gain their sense of identity, their sense of belonging. And each week I say this, but we do have a special guest with us. And this week we have Siong Ng, who is going to be our guest, and he is a clinical senior lecturer, professor of cardiac electrophysiology at Imperial College. You know, it's a pleasure to have him on, and he's going to share his stories of his transition to this. Well, I'm not going to steal his thunder. No, I'm not going to steal your thunder. It's the last day. Can you tell me a little bit? I'm going to start off with my question, right? Which is, can you tell me a little bit about what it was that gave you your sense of identity, sense of belonging when you were growing up? And tell us a little bit about growing up.
Great. Well, firstly, thanks for the invitation to be on this interview. It's a pleasure to be here. And secondly, apologies if there's any interruption. I'm sitting in my NHS clinic, and often people knock on the door and try and ask me questions. So if there's any minor interruptions, then I apologize in advance, but hopefully there won't be any, or if they are, they'll be very minor. So back to your first question, Wayne, about my sort of where I grew up and my identity and also my sense of belonging. I grew up in Malaysia. And in fact, I spent my first 16 years in Malaysia before I moved to the UK with my immediate family. And I've been here since, and I've been here for the last 27 years. So I guess in terms of my identity, I have multiple senses of identity and belonging. I feel clearly Malaysian and Malaysian Chinese, which is where I grew up. But I spent the majority of my life in the UK and certainly feel very British as well. My wife is American and my kids are American British. So there's another third bit of aspect to my identity. So I guess I feel very international and very proud of it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you made the transition from Malaysia to the UK when you were about 16. So that's a kind of like a teenage years, formative years, developmental years, as it were. How was that transition for you?
I guess it was in some aspects not straightforward, in others quite easy. I was at the stage where when you're 16, you have very established friend groups and you don't want to leave that. So when I heard we were going to move to the UK and the whole family was going to move, clearly I would rather have had all my friends with me and carried on doing what I was doing. That was one aspect. Another aspect was the language aspect. In Malaysia, the main language is Malay. I speak Malay and Mandarin at home. And moving to the UK meant sort of having to speak English, which we learned as a second language. But that was another issue. The weather was an issue with the transition. Having grew up somewhere which was always nice and warm and on the equator, essentially 30 degrees every day. We moved, I remember, in December, right in sort of bleak winter time. That was a bit of a transition. The culture, everything is a bit different. But as you know, when you move, there's a lot to get used to. But potentially, you're probably at the most adaptable at that stage when you are in your teenage years and very receptive to new things. So yes, there was a lot to change, but it was probably a good time to move because I was open to lots of changes at that stage.
It's a new experience. So I'm just thinking about being 16 again, halfway, but being 16 again and kind of like education-wise and things like that. So you had moved, had you completed were there, like, I know in the UK we have our GCSEs, had you completed your first set of equivalents of GCSEs? How was that and what was your aspirations from there?
Yeah, so I had completed the sort of GCSE equivalent at that stage. So I was just moving into A levels. And then when I came to the UK, I enrolled in the school in Southeast London and did my A levels there. So the transition in terms of the academic curriculum wasn't difficult. We did covered the same ground in terms of chemistry, biology, physics, and maths. The language of instruction was different. We used Malay for all the sciences, and I had to get used to some of the English terminology, but the concepts were the same. So that made it easy. And maths is maths. Whatever language you speak, it's equations and numbers. So that was fairly straightforward. So I think because I did sciences, the transition in school was potentially a lot easier than if I was to do the humanities or languages, because there's a lot of overlap. Whatever language you use, it's the same chemical equation or the same mathematical equation.
Yeah. So with that, then going into the sciences, what was your motivation? What was? Did you have a career path, or did you have an idea of what it was that you wanted to do? And how was it making friends in this new school? 16-year-old young man. What was it like for you?
So the first question, I guess, is what I wanted to do, and I always was strongly attracted to the sciences, and for many years it was sort of between medicine, which I ended up choosing, and engineering, and I couldn't quite decide, and maybe made my choice around the time when I moved to the UK that I wanted to do medicine. So I'd always been quite good at maths and sciences, and that's where I gravitated. And picking the sciences for A levels meant that both avenues were still open, but by then I pretty much decided I was going to apply for medicine. Fitting in, I was lucky that it was quite a receptive school. It was a school in Bexley Heath in Southeast London, and there was a group of friends that were very receptive to new people coming in, and they invited me to all the things that they did and to their homes, and it was settling. It was not a difficult process to me, but I was lucky. I know it's not everyone's experience, but I was lucky enough to have a small group of friends at school who were very, very open to me joining the friend group.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's really good. And in terms of like, you said that you kind of like was the toss up between engineering and medicine, and you've ended up going into medicine. What were your role models? Who were your examples? What was it that made you gravitate more towards medicine in the end?
Yeah, so my dad's a GP, and he was a GP working in Malaysia. So I obviously had some exposure to what it was like to be a doctor. Malaysia, the practice of medicine is very different to how it's practiced here and how the health service is set up. So there are lots of differences. But I knew the lifestyle, and I kind of knew what it was to be a doctor, and the work that needed to go into it, and the subject matter, and the interactions with different individuals. All of those things, I guess, in the end swayed it for me and helped me to make decisions. But I guess it would be my father, who I have seen growing up working in that role, that was the role model.
So did he push you towards coming into joining the family business, as it were? We both was it that, or was it kind of like be yourself? How did he?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point, because I think there are parents who quite like their children to go down the same path. I think my parents were very careful not to do that. In fact, they would often say the opposite and say, "Are you really sure you want to do this? Because you've seen the life of a doctor and how committed you have to be." So I don't think they were discouraging me. They certainly weren't pushing me, but they wanted me to arrive at my own choice. And I also wanted to think hard about it until I finally made my decision around A-level time. So there's certainly no pressure. And in retrospect, I'm very glad I've done what I've done.
So, but you must have had a passion as well. It's very good that you'd already witnessed elements of being a doctor, going into medicine, but it's still different, you making that choice. So going on then into university, how was your university experience, and what was it that helped you to kind of like go off into the specialism that you've chosen as your career?
Yeah. So the transition, I think, from Malaysia to the UK around A-level time was not straightforward, because I was the only new person in school joining afresh, whereas everyone else had been there for 5 years and knew each other very well. And going to university was almost a fresh start for everyone. It was quite nice and refreshing for me because everyone who ended up at university as a fresher, had not been there before, and we were all trying to get used to being in a new place and being independent, away from home, away from parents. So it was a really nice environment for me. And I kind of thrived at that. I went to St. George's, which is a medical school in South London, and had a really good time there over 6 years. And it was perhaps around the sort of early years that I decided that cardiology was for me, because I was fascinated by how the heart worked and how everything kind of just makes sense. You know, if you understood physiology and how what happened in one chamber of the heart affected the other, you kind of understood how it worked and what could go wrong and how you could fix it if it went wrong.
So there was a number of elements which kind of like came together. A new start, you viewed university almost like as a second new start, but one where you were more on a equal playing field, as it were, because everybody was a new starter. I like that. But then with cardiology, it was about the mechanistic, not the simplicity of the mechanism, but understanding what's going on. So give us a typical day as a cardiologist. What would it be that you would do? And what is it that you're looking at?
I guess as a cardiologist, there's no such thing as a typical cardiologist. We all have very different day-to-day plans. So I am an academic cardiologist, which means I spend half my time in the university setting and the other half my time in the NHS setting. There's some colleagues who just do 5 days in the NHS. For me, I guess I'm in the minority, and I do have a 50-50 split between the university and the NHS. So a typical week would involve me spending a day doing an outpatient clinic, which I will do this afternoon, where I see patients coming into the room and talk to them about their problems and book tests, but all in an outpatient setting. I spend a day operating in the sort of cath lab setting, where we do keyhole procedures and put tubes into the heart of patients and record electrical signals and treat heart rhythm problems. And in the university side, I spent 2.5 days essentially supervising PhD students and postdocs looking into heart rhythm problems. And I also head up the BSc teaching program, where we teach undergraduates about cardiovascular science. So the role is very varied, and almost from day to day, it's entirely different. Okay. But for me, very refreshing, and I like the variety.
So what was it that made you kind of like choose to go into the kind of like the dual role of clinician and academic? I can understand with kind of like going into medicine, your father was, but what about the academic side? What was that? What drew your attention or attraction to that?
Yeah, so in medical school, we would do an intercalated degree, which means that in a 5-year course, you squeeze in an extra year and you get a BSc degree. Yeah. And that year would be very much science focused and research focused. And when I was doing my intercalated BSc, I did a project looking into blood pressure in pregnant women and how the capillaries affected that. And although it was a very simple undergraduate student type study, it sort of exposed me to research and asking research questions and then testing your hypothesis, analyzing data and making conclusions. And that whole process in that year was probably the best year of medical school for me in terms of how much I enjoyed doing the science. And at that point, I guess I decided ideally I would want to go down a path where I could not only just see and treat patients, but spend some time doing science and asking my own research questions and answering them. So it was probably the 3rd year of medical school, being exposed to science, that made me think, okay, I do want to see and treat patients, but I don't want that to be the entirety of my job. And I want to spend half my time asking cool questions and using research to help my patients.
So it was almost like going back to, you said earlier on that during your A-levels, or throughout your academic career or up to that point, you had always enjoyed science. So that questioning nature of science was something which still existed, not just treating the patient, but also answering those questions and being the generator of those questions. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think you'd be right. And having started off by saying that I was sort of torn between engineering and medicine, a lot of my work now in my research group really interacts with bioengineers and electrical engineers in trying to develop new software or new tools to try and treat patients with heart rhythm problems. So it sort of come full circle, and I'm bringing the two bits of it, sort of seeing patients and treating them, but also engaging in research.
So I know that must be quite demanding on your time. How do you get the balance right between the different areas? I know you said you have a day where you do this, a day where you do that, but a typical day seems to end when the day finishes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's something that people warned me about when I thought about doing this path. Other colleagues have the same experience, and when you have two roles, it's not really 50-50, and people say it's 80-80, and you add up to more than 100% of your time doing things. And I think time management is important. It's easy to say time management is important, but I think time discipline is also important. I think knowing when to stop doing stuff and saying this can wait, because there is the clinical aspect, there's a research aspect, but I also have a young family. I have 2 children, aged 6 and 3, and it would be very easy to bring all that work home on the weekend. And having the time management, but also the time discipline to say there are some times that I will just do this or where I won't work, I think it's important to try and keep sane. Otherwise, you probably would just burn out trying to do 2 roles in half the time, really.
Yeah, in less than half the time, really, because it's 2 full-time roles. I totally understand that. So because the kind of like the title of the show is about your sense of belonging, sense of identity, what is it about the cardiology family, as it were? How do you gain your sense of belonging within that sphere or within that arena?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I really given it a lot of thought about until I was invited to. Sort of the word belonging is something that I guess I've sort of given it more thought since I was invited to participate in this. I feel like the cardiology community is quite welcoming and very diverse in terms of backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, nationalities. So it's quite a diverse community to start off with. And I never felt at any point when I was doing my training that I was a total outsider. I felt like I was like many of my peers that are very international, training in cardiology, and then where I'm now, again, it's quite a diverse, because I feel I belong very much in the community, given what I do. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's a good answer.
That's fine. I'll probe a little bit more, but that's fine. No, I understand that. So because you've been working at Imperial now for about, is it 10 years or so? What was it that what drew you over to Imperial from St. George's, or your transitions there?
Yeah, so the way cardiology training works, before you become a consultant, you have to spend, 4 or 5 years doing general medicine, another 5 or 6 years training in cardiology before you get the certificate to say you are now qualified as a cardiologist.
Yeah.
And for my cardiology training, I get allocated a region in the UK, and mine was Northwest Thames, which is Northwest London.
Yeah.
And therefore, I trained in several hospitals in Northwest London, and I chose to do a PhD in Northwest London, and therefore at Imperial. So my first interaction with Imperial College was when I registered as a PhD student in 2008, in the middle of my cardiology training, to do a 3-year PhD. And I guess I've not really left. Since then, I've done a postdoc, but I was affiliated with Imperial, or I went to the US. And when I then came back to clinical training, I was a clinical lecturer, which is all within Imperial, and I have been here for now coming up to 14 years.
Right. You mentioned something there, which you said about when you were a postdoc. You did your PhD in cardiology, and then you did a postdoc in collaborations with a university in the States. Did you go and live in the States for a time, or how was the interaction, and how was that transition to the States?
Yeah, so I spent a year out there. I would
Mhm.
love to spend more time, but as a clinical trainee, they don't let you go away for too long
Yeah.
because they want you to finish training. So I went to Washington University in St. Louis in the Midwest,
Mhm.
and I spent a year there doing research. But because the funding was through the British Heart Foundation, I still was basically affiliated with Imperial, although I spent the entire year out there.
Mhm.
And that was great because that was yet another transition. Because I started off by saying I'm very international. I seem to have moved countries many times.
Yeah.
And that was yet another fresh start, as it were, because I went to a totally new place, having come to the UK and be not know anyone in school, then university, and then I made another transition when I went to the US and almost started afresh. And it was very nice because I was in my, I guess, early 30s then, and to have that sort of fresh start is really nice, just to meet new people and have a totally fresh group of friends and colleagues. Was a good experience, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I like the idea of the fact, as you said, that you're international. You came from you were born in Malaysia, came to the UK, but you've been abroad to America and everything like that. So all of those are kind of like feeding into who you are, your identity. So you're a man, I'm going to say international man of mystery, right?
Yeah, and I think there's this to deride to this. There's this terrible phrase from Theresa May. You may remember from a few years ago. She said, "If you're a citizen of if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere," is what she said. I kind of disagree with that. I think there are lots of us who feel that actually being international and having embraced lots of different cultures is a good way to go. As I said, my kids are international. They have American and UK passports. They feel very international. And I guess in terms of belonging in my identity, I feel I have multiple aspects to my identity. I don't just feel affiliated to one specific community because of my experience thus far.
Mm-hmm. So you've embraced those cultures. It's not something that it's kind of like I only want to know about my culture. You've gone in and you've embraced the different cultures, learned about the different cultures, and taken the good from the bad from those cultures. And would you say that was something which you've done?
Yes, true, definitely true that I've embraced many cultures, but also having been abroad now, it's also strengthened my initial identity of being Malaysian. So when you grow up and everyone's the same, you don't really think about things like belonging and identity because you are in a place of comfort and what you know is everyone's the same. It's when you have to move abroad and be different that your initial identity becomes stronger. So I would say actually my sort of Malaysian Chinese identity has become a lot stronger in my mind since moving to the UK, whereas it was a thing that I never even thought about when I was in Malaysia, because it was just, we're all the same. We're all growing up in Malaysia. There's nothing really to say about identity. And then it's really strengthened my view of identity, having moved abroad and moved to different countries on a couple of occasions.
I like that. I like that notion. I really do. I like that notion of the fact that actually, because oftentimes the way we think about it is by othering, that actually I didn't realize that I was Black until I came to this country. I didn't realize I was Malaysian until I came to this country. But you're saying actually we should use that as a strength to embrace our own community, recognize what it is that makes us different, but at the same time, look at how that can strengthen the new community that we're in. So then,
yeah, and I totally agree. I think one example is my name. I think a lot of people in Malaysia, when they're growing up, wanted to have English names because it was cool to have an English name and add on something that was easy to pronounce.
yeah.
But actually, when I moved to the UK, I felt very strongly that I wanted to hold on to my Chinese sounding name, no matter how difficult it is to pronounce for everyone. It puts everyone, whenever they're trying to introduce me, they really struggle. I could have easily picked sort of an English name to add on to it to make it easy. But I felt actually moving here, it strengthened my identity of being Malaysian Chinese. I was very keen to hold on to a very difficult, unpronounceable name without adding anything easy for anyone.
Well, thanks for that one. No, I totally understand. The name is who you are. It's what your parents chose for you. So it's very important. Yeah.
Yeah, people do though. People do just add a sort of English name like Mike, something that, and then they make it easy, and they will sort of use their Chinese name separately for official purposes, but will have a name, that nickname, as it were. But I was very keen, actually, in fact, and that comes to having this identity being strengthened when you are the minority. When you come to a different place and feel different, you think, fine, I want to hold on to that because that's important to me.
So no, that's brilliant. I'm just thinking about the whole the scenario that you've painted, or the life which you've described. I should ask anyone if they've got any questions which they would like to also ask. What you mentioned earlier on about the fact that the group in which you work is a very diverse group. What would you say each individual, you don't have to name them by name, but what is it that everybody is able to contribute, and how is those differences, would you say, able to give a more nuanced approach to the way people approach a problem? Have you experienced that, I suppose, is what I'm trying to ask.
That's a really good question. So my research group, so let's focus on my own research group, and that's a very diverse group. When I last counted, so there are about 12 of us, and there were 10 different nationalities, and the vast majority do not have English as a first language, and the majority were not born in the UK. So we have, people from India, from China, from Italy, from Ireland, from the Czech Republic. It's a real mishmash. And I don't know how. It wasn't because I was actively seeking these people, but I've ended up with a group that is extremely diverse in terms of backgrounds, upbringing, culture, and language. I think, firstly, at the personal level, it's very nice to have that. We had our Christmas meal a couple of nights ago. It's nice just to learn about different people from very different cultures and work together. There are some, I'm not saying it's all easy. There are some barriers. Different people work in different styles of communicating, different ways of working together as a team that you have to get used to, and people have their own individual way that may reflect their own culture and their upbringing. So there's overcoming that. They bring unique perspectives. In the scientific world, I wouldn't say that makes a huge difference. Science is science wherever you grew up, but potentially just having different people, different ways of working. Sometimes you get new ideas and new sparks between different individuals that could be beneficial for the group. But I like it. I like the fact that the group is very, very heterogeneous, very, very culturally different. And every time we have a social evening, it's always really nice to hear about all the sort of different experiences that people have. But very, very different.
No, that's brilliant. That's really nice to hear. It's interesting that one of the points which you made was almost like that within science, you can almost look beyond. Would you say you can look beyond the diversity within science? Do you think that's the case? Or
well, I think diversity is good, but I think when you come down to actually just focusing on the scientific problem, where you come from and what language you speak, and maybe does not factor too much if you have a scientific problem to solve and everyone knows their role and got some experiments to do or some models to create. So potentially the effect is not that great. I don't think it really affects what we do.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm just thinking. I haven't seen anyone put their hands up for any questions, but I had another question which I was thinking, just in terms of your research, right? Just in terms of your actual research, you mentioned about that you make devices. Your research looks at devices. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what kind of devices, how it is, and
so we don't. Yeah, I think so. We don't build hardware, but so maybe just very briefly about what the research I do. So my focus is on heart rhythm problems, because I treat people with arrhythmias. but my group is, again, not just diverse from the ethnic and cultural background, but diverse in the scientific background. So I've got clinicians, biologists, physicists, engineers, all working to try and solve the same problem. And we do very simple, we do, biological experiments. We record data from patients, but we also, what I was alluding to was developing sort of signal processing software algorithms rather than actual hardware stuff to handle signals from the heart and to understand what's going on within the heart and what arrhythmia is happening and how we can treat it. So it's really, I guess, developing more software than hardware.
Right. Okay. But so it's just taking the mechanism and being able to develop a taking the raw data of the physical outputs and finding ways of interpreting what those signals mean.
Correct. Yeah. What you get is sort of lots of electrical signals that look like uninterpretable squiggly lines recorded from the heart, and using those to understand how the electrical wavefront is moving through the heart and where the areas are that you need to treat. These are the things that we're developing. Is one aspect of what the group is doing.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. That sounds really interesting. Right. I'm gonna ask one or two final questions, right? I think I alluded to these earlier on. And those questions are as follows. If you're talking to your 16-year-old self, okay, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self about where potentially you would end up? And the second one, especially when thinking about your transitions and stuff, but the second one, what would be the wow factor that your younger self would look and say, wow, I didn't think that I would be able to do that? You can either answer one or both of those questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to handle both. So the first one is what advice I would give to my 16-year-old self. I would probably say take more risks. I'm a sort of very conventional guy. I've planned out what I want to do in the next 5-10 years, and I kind of adhere to it. And if you ask me what I wanted to do when I was in medical school, I would probably say I wanted to become an academic cardiologist and spend half my time doing cardiology, half my time leading a research group. And I just followed that path. And potentially I missed out on some unknown great opportunities if I was more of a risk taker, more open to trying new things or risky things. I mean, it's worked out well for me, and I've ended up where I wanted to be. But I would probably like my younger self to be more of a risk taker if I were to go back and sort of relive that last 20 years. Okay,
that's brilliant. Risky business, I think, is what I'm calling it. Right. Okay. And what would you say would be the wow factor if you want to tackle that one as well?
Yeah, I guess it's the other side of the same coin, which is my 9-year-old self probably wanted me to become a successful cardiologist and do what I'm doing now, and it would probably be impressed that I managed to follow through on my goals. So having not taken the risk and followed down the sort of straightforward, down the middle path, I've achieved what I want to do when I was young, and I'm, I guess, very happy to have done it.
That's brilliant. Actually, sometimes it's calculated risks. Although you say that I'm not a risk taker, there's always an element in risk in everything that we do. Even if we think we've nailed it on, there's still an element that things may not happen the way that we had planned out. But I really do like that, and I do like hearing your story. I'm going to just say a big thank you, right, for being our guest this week, and you're the final guest of the year, and your story has been really enlightening, hearing your journey. So I just want to say another big thank you for being our guest on Belonging this week. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm just going to share the final. Oh, I can't believe that we've come to the end of 2022 already. It just seems like it was only yesterday that we were entering this year. So to be in 2022 and to be announcing our first guest for 2023 is quite something. And our first guest is going to be a young man called Brian Bovary, and he is a co-founder of the Imperial Homage exhibition and a diversity and inclusion African arts kind of consultant at the moment. He's a up and coming young man, and he's going to be sharing some of his experiences with us on the 13th. So we're taking a little break on the 13th of January from 12:30. So the 13th of January at 12:30. And if you haven't seen any of the other interviews, or you'd like to revisit some of the videos which we've done before, then please go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO. And you can see so many of the other stories which we have gone through. There's some real gems in there, as was today's. A few of my highlights, or a few of the highlights from, you can have a look at that. But all of this would never have happened if it wasn't for these wonderful people who have shared their stories. So as you go into 2023, as we go over the Christmas period, just remember that everyone has a story. It's just when you're ready to tell it. Okay, so just want to leave that and just say a happy Christmas and a prosperous new year to everyone. So thanks everyone for tuning in.